Hey there, come closer to the fire for a while, because this story begins in the dark, with 3 tired ships drifting on black water, and 90 men who believe they may be sailing into the end of the world. It is the night of October 11th, 1492. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina groan softly as the waves lift them and let them fall. Their wood is swollen with salt. Their ropes are stiff. Their sails hang above the decks like pale wings in the moonlight. Below, the air is thick with sweat, old food, bilgewater, damp wool, and the kind of fear that has been carried too long in too little space. The men have been at sea for 33 days since leaving the Canary Islands. 33 days of water in every direction. 33 days of prayers spoken into wind. 33 days of eating hard biscuit and salted meat. Of waking to the same horizon. Of wondering whether their captain has led them beyond the mercy of maps. Christopher Columbus stands on the deck of the Santa Maria, watching for signs. Abert, a branch, a change in the water, anything. He has already been lying to his crew, quietly, carefully, almost politely, which is often how dangerous lies prefer to dress themselves. He keeps 2 logs, one for himself, with the fuller distance, one for the men, with a smaller distance, something less frightening, something that can still fit inside a tired sailor mind. He knows that truth can break morale faster than a storm can break a mast. And still, he watches. What nobody on those ships understands is that they are not approaching Asia, not Japan, not China, not the outer islands of the Great Khan. They are approaching a world that has lived apart from Europe for thousands of years, a world with its own crops, canoes, gods, gardens, languages, illnesses, songs, dead. The men on the ships think they are reaching the edge of one known world. They are really about to collide with another. That is the part the old schoolbook story rarely lets breathe. This was not a clean discovery. It was not a bright, heroic doorway opening neatly into progress. It was a meeting wrapped in misunderstanding from the first moment. A legal claim spoken to people who could not understand it. Glass beads glittering in hands that did not yet know what greed had crossed the sea. And invisible sickness breathing quietly among the living. If you enjoy these slow, dark histories told by the fire, like this video and subscribe. It helps keep this little night room open for the next story. Now, let the room settle. No need for anything dramatic. Let the fire crackle. Let your shoulders loosen a little. We will move slowly, because the real story of 1492 is not only about ships. It is about 2 separated worlds meeting in the dark before either one could understand the cost. Listen to the ships first. The Santa Maria is the largest, but large is a generous word. She is a working cargo vessel, built to haul things like grain and wine, not to become a symbol in children books. She is roughly the length of a small modern room stretched into a boat, sturdy enough for Atlantic work, but still tiny beneath the sky. The Pinta and the Nina are faster and more nimble, carols, practical vessels with enough courage in their bones to cross dangerous water. If wood can be said to have courage. At night, everything sounds alive. The hull creaks. The rigging taps. The sea slaps and slides along the planks. A sleeping man coughs below deck. Another mutters a prayer. Someone shifts and curses softly because there is never enough room for elbows, knees, pride, or fear. Salt dries on faces. Hands crack. Eyes burn from wind. Columbus has promised land. He has promised distance. He has promised that Asia is close enough to reach before the food and water fail. The promise is the problem, because Columbus is wrong. He is not wrong about the earth being round. Educated Europeans already knew that. The old myth that everyone thought the world was flat is one of those cheerful little mistakes history leaves lying around like a banana peel. The real debate was size. How far was Asia if one sailed west? Careful estimates made the distance enormous. Columbus chose smaller numbers, stretched Asia wider than it was, squeezed the ocean smaller than it was, and created a world on paper that he could survive. If the Americas had not existed, his expedition would likely have vanished into the ocean. That is the eerie truth. He succeeded because he was wrong, and because an unknown continent stood in the way of his mistake. For weeks, the men have watched the captain turn error into certainty. At first, perhaps it comforted them. A captain must sound sure. At sea, doubt spreads like rot in a barrel. But as the days lengthen and no coast appears, confidence begins to feel like madness. By the second week, the ocean becomes too much. Nothing but blue by day, black by night, and the long roll of swells under small ships. The sailors know storms. They know hunger. They know bad captains and worse luck. But this endless westward push feels different. The trade winds carry them onward with a steadiness that first seems like blessing, then begins to feel like a trap. If the wind keeps pushing west, how will they ever return east? Then the seaweed appears. The ships enter the Sargasso Sea, a wide, slow region of floating vegetation. The weed drifts and gathers around the hulls, tangles near the rudders, slides along the water in mats that look almost like drowned fields. To modern eyes, it is a natural ocean zone. To men in 1492, it must have felt like the sea was changing its mind about being water. Imagine standing at the rail in the late afternoon, watching green weed stretch across the surface, mile after mile, with no shore in sight. The ship moves, but slowly. The rudder pulls. The men whisper. Someone says the ocean is becoming land. Someone else says they will be trapped here forever, caught in a floating meadow where no horse can run and no church bell will ever sound. Honestly, sailors have always been practical people until they are terrified, and then imagination becomes a very busy crew member. Columbus reassures them. The winds will change. The weeds mean nothing. The signs are good. Keep sailing. But by late September, the whispers have sharpened. Mutiny is not yet a knife drawn in open light. It is a murmur beside barrels, a glance across the deck, a silence when Columbus walks near. It is men counting days in their heads, men judging whether their lives are worth more than one Genoese dream. Then hope begins to arrive in pieces. Birds. A small flock in the distance. Then more birds. Floating branches. A carved stick. Fresh vegetation. A little branch with berries still attached. Bright against the water like a message from land. The crew swings between belief and despair. Every sign is proof for a moment. Every empty horizon takes proof away again. The human mind is not built for endless uncertainty. It wants a coast. It wants a wall. It wants something that does not move beneath the feet. By October 10th, the strain is almost too much. The Pinzon brothers, respected captains, help hold the expedition together. A compromise forms. Another few days. Then perhaps they turn back. Columbus agrees outwardly, though his inward certainty may already have passed the point where agreement meant anything. He has risked too much to return with nothing. Then comes October 11th. The signs multiply. More birds than before. Green things in the water. Shallow-looking seas. Columbus thinks he sees a faint light in the distance. A small flicker rising and falling. Was it real? Was it imagination? Was it a torch on shore? Was it moonlight playing with the desperate eye of a man who needed history to arrive before his crew lost patience? We cannot know. But after midnight, the darkness gives way. A lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, sees what the others have longed to see. A pale shape, a white edge in moonlight. Land. The cry crosses the water. Tierra. Land. Men wake. Feet stumble across planks. Hands grip rails. The dark horizon is no longer only dark. Something interrupts it. Something solid. After 33 days, after hidden logs and wet rope and mutiny breath, the ocean has finally ended. The ships do not rush in. No one knows the reef, the depth, the shore. They wait offshore in darkness, rocking gently, while the island ahead slowly becomes real. And this is the most haunting pause in the whole story. The Europeans wait for morning, believing they have found islands near Asia. The Taino people on shore watch the strange ships, believing visitors have come from somewhere beyond ordinary experience. No one understands the full thing. No one sees the future. No one sees the vanished villages, the forced labor, the diseases, the treaties, the empires, the sugar fields, the horses, the pigs, the wheat, the potatoes crossing oceans, the cities rising and falling, the languages changing, the maps redrawn, the statues built and pulled down, the arguments still alive 5 centuries later. For now, there is only dark water. 3 ships, a low island, and 2 worlds waiting for dawn. To understand how those ships came to be there, we have to let the Atlantic fade for a moment and turn back toward Europe. Not the Europe of clean paintings and noble portraits, but a wounded continent shaped by plague, war, religious fear, empty treasuries, and the smell of smoke in narrow streets. Columbus did not sail out of calm confidence. He sailed out of a hungry age, where kings wanted spices, merchants wanted profit, and one stubborn navigator had convinced himself that Asia was closer than it was. The Atlantic took him because Europe let him go. The night waited, and far ahead, beyond the reach of his maps, the island people lived their last hours in a world that still belonged entirely to itself. Europe in 1492 did not smell like marble halls and fresh parchment. It smelled of smoke, dung, damp wool, river mood, old fear, and too many people living too close together behind walls that had seen better centuries. If you were walking with me through a city street at dusk, you would want to lift your robe or cloak above the filth in the lane. You would hear wheels grinding over stones, pigs snuffling near doorways, vendors calling, bells marking hours, and somewhere, always somewhere, a cough that made people glance away. The Black Death was more than a century behind them, but a century is not as long as it sounds when half the graveyards in a region still remember. Some villages never recovered. Fields had gone back to grass and forest. Churches stood with fewer voices under their roofs. The plague had broken the old labor order, raised the value of workers, and made powerful people nervous. Because unsettled worlds always make power reach for harder tools. Spain felt this nervousness in its own fierce way. In January of 1492, Granada fell. The last Muslim kingdom in Iberia surrendered after years of siege, and Ferdinand and Isabella stood at the end of a long Christian campaign remembered as the Reconquista. Bells rang. Banners changed. A war that had shaped Spanish identity for generations was suddenly over. That victory brought glory. It also brought a problem. What does a kingdom built around holy war do when the war ends? It looks for another form of unity. Within months, the Alhambra decree ordered Jews who refused conversion to leave the Spanish kingdoms. Around 200,000 people were forced from lives their families had built over centuries. Some converted under pressure. Some left with whatever they could carry. Homes were sold too quickly. Shops emptied. Libraries scattered. A child might ask why the neighbors were leaving, and an adult might not know how to answer without tasting ash. This was not only religious zeal, it was also statecraft, and statecraft can be terribly cold when it dresses itself as purity. The monarchs wanted one faith, one crown, one Spanish identity. They wanted confiscated wealth. They wanted control. They wanted the story of their kingdom to be clean, even if cleaning it meant breaking living people. And they needed money. Granada had cost a fortune. Armies eat coins almost as quickly as they eat bread. A victorious monarchy can still have empty chests. Across Europe, rulers were looking east with hungry eyes. Spices were the obsession. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. To a modern kitchen, they may seem like small luxuries in little jars, but in the late medieval world, they were wealth, medicina, preservation, status, and profit all at once. Spices moved from the islands of Southeast Asia through the Indian Ocean, through Muslim and Asian traders, through the Eastern Mediterranean, into the hands of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, and finally into European markets. Every hand took a share. By the time pepper reached a noble table in Europe, it had traveled through so many palms that its price had swollen like a proud merchant at a banquet. Find a direct route to Asia, and the old chain could be broken. Portugal had been trying for decades. Its ships moved down the coast of Africa, slowly learning winds, currents, compass, harbors, and danger. The Portuguese plan was practical, difficult, and long. Sail around Africa, reach India by sea, bypass the old middlemen. Columbus wanted another road. West. He was born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa, around 1451, son of a wool weaver. Not a prince, not a great lord, not the sort of man portraits later try to make taller by lighting him from below. He came from working life, from a city of merchants, sailors, deals, debts, and restless horizons. He went to sea young, learned winds and currents, learned the language of crews, ports, cargo, and risk. And somewhere in those years, he began to believe that Asia could be reached by sailing west. Again, the educated did not think the earth was flat. Let that little myth drift away like a gull over the wake. The question was distance. Careful estimates made the westward route to Asia far too long for the ships and supplies of the age. Columbus, however, chose numbers that made the ocean smaller. He leaned on the smallest possible circumference of the earth and the largest possible size of Asia. He moved Japan closer on paper, and once it was close on paper, he treated it as close enough for wooden ships. Was he lying, or did he truly believe it? We cannot be sure. Honestly, I suspect the answer may be more human than either. People can lie to others after first lying to themselves. Ambition can polish a bad calculation until it shines like revelation. Columbus needed his idea to be true, and need is a very persuasive scholar when it sits alone with maps at night. He took the plan to Portugal. King John II had experts examine it. They rejected it. The distances were wrong. The supplies would fail. The ocean was too wide. The experts were correct. If the Americas had not been there, Columbus would likely have died between his dream and Asia. He tried elsewhere. England did not take him. France did not take him. Spain turned him away at first because Ferdinand and Isabella were consumed by the war for Granada. For years, Columbus hovered near the Spanish court, living on support, making allies, waiting, pressing the same proposal into any hand that might carry it upward. His advocates mattered. Luis de Santangle, the royal treasurer, helped. The friar, Juan Perez, helped. Others whispered that the risk was small compared with the possible prize. Ferdinand and Isabella did not need to be true believers. They needed to be gamblers with an eye for profit. The cost of 3 ships and provisions was not enormous by royal standards. If Columbus disappeared, he would join the long list of men swallowed by the sea, and the crown would lose money, but not a kingdom. If he succeeded, Spain might reach Asia by a route Portugal did not control. Spices, gold, converts, titles, and glory might flow westward into Spanish hands. Columbus demanded much, a share of wealth, titles, governorship, hereditary privileges. He asked, like a man bargaining with a future only he could see. The demands were outrageous if he failed, irrelevant if he vanished, and potentially very expensive if he succeeded. The crown accepted because success seemed unlikely enough to be affordable. That is how history sometimes begins. Not with certainty, with a contract no one fully expects to matter. On April 17th, 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. The agreement gave Columbus the chance he had chased for years. He would sail west under the authority of Ferdinand and Isabella, bearing letters to rulers of Asia, including a great Khan whose dynasty had in fact ended long before. That detail is almost painfully perfect. Columbus set out with documents addressed to a political world that no longer existed, hoping to find a geography that was not where he believed it was. Maps can be wrong in more than one way. And then came Palos, August 3rd, 1492. Before dawn, the port is dark and practical. No golden light yet. No history painting. Just damp air, low voices, men hauling, ropes tightening, barrels being checked. A priest perhaps muttering a blessing, families standing in the uncertain half-shadow between farewell and ordinary mourning. The tide matters more than drama. Ships leave when water allows them to leave. The Santa Maria carries Columbus as admiral. The Pinta and the Nina sail with him, commanded by the Pinzon brothers and their people, local men whose knowledge and reputation helped make the expedition possible. Around 90 men in all. Some professionals, a few pardoned men, specialists, a translator who knew Arabic because Columbus expected to reach Asia, men who wanted wages, opportunity, rank, profit, escape, adventure, or simply work. They were not all fools. They were not all heroes. They were men. That is usually more dangerous. They sailed first to the Canary Islands for repairs and supplies. The Pinta needed work. Water and provisions were taken on. The last familiar food was loaded. The last known harbor held them for a while. Then, on September 6th, they pushed into the open ocean. This was the true departure. Europe fell behind. The horizon closed. The first days were kind enough to be misleading. Good winds, progress, confidence. The trade winds seemed to carry them west with a firm hand. Columbus read the ocean as if Providence had agreed with him. Perhaps some of the men believed it too. It is easy to believe in a captain when the weather helps his story. Then the days repeated. Blue water, blue sky, dark water, stars, the same again and again. A week at sea is adventure. 2 weeks can still be courage. 3 weeks begins to become a question asked by every plank in the ship. The men ate hard biscuit and salted meat that did more to maintain life than to please it. Water grew stale. Clothes stiffened with salt. Sleep came in pieces. Privacy vanished. A ship is a village with no streets and no escape. Columbus kept his 2 logs. The public numbers told the men they were not too far from safety. The private numbers told him more of the truth. This was not simply deceit for amusement. It was management. It was fear, control. It was also a sign of the imbalance that would follow him into the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had the right to shape what others knew if shaping it served his goal. That habit begins at sea, before any flag touches sand. By the time October came, the expedition was no longer a neat proposal signed in a royal camp. It was a collection of tired bodies on creaking wood, pushed by winds toward a place that did not exist on their maps. The Europe that sent them, with its plague scars, emptied treasuries, expelled communities, spice hunger, and royal ambition, was far behind. But its assumptions were aboard. Its hunger was aboard. Its legal imagination was aboard. When they reached land, Europe would step ashore with them. All of them were sleeping, or praying, or muttering aboard those ships. And ahead, beyond the last dark hours, the Taino were watching the impossible sails. Their world had its own order, and it had not asked to be discovered. The beach was waiting. The flags were waiting. The unread proclamation was waiting. And morning was already beginning to gather its pale light over Guanahani. The open Atlantic did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived as distance. After the Canary Islands slipped behind them, the 3 ships moved into a blue emptiness that seemed at first almost kind. The morning winds filled the sails. The ropes tightened with a sound like breath drawn through teeth. The sun rose clean over the water, and for a few days the men could pretend that the voyage was only a longer version of voyages they already knew. A sailor can endure danger if it has shape. A reef has shape. A storm has shape. A hostile coast has shape. Even hunger has a kind of shape when the bags and barrels can be counted. But distance at sea has no face. It repeats. It takes the same horizon and gives it back again at dawn, then again at noon, then again under stars, until the mind begins to ask whether the world has become a circle of water with one small ship trapped at the center. Columbus watched the water with the intensity of a man trying to force meaning from it. He watched the color of the sea. He watched birds. He watched the drift of weed and branches. He watched the faces of his men, which may have been the most dangerous signs of all. The ocean could be calm, but a crew can become weather. On the first days after leaving the Canaries, spirits were not yet broken. There was work to do. Sails needed trimming. Lines needed checking. Barrels needed securing. Men argued about small things because small arguments are easier than admitting large fear. The ships moved west under steady winds, and Columbus read that wind as blessing. He also kept writing. 2 sets of distances. 1 truth for his own reckoning. 1 softer truth for the men. Each day, when the public distance was given, the numbers were made gentler, smaller, less frightening. It was not a grand lie spoken from a throne. It was a daily adjustment, the kind of lie that becomes furniture inside a plan. A few miles hidden here, a few more hidden there. Fear trimmed back like a sail. Honestly, it is hard not to understand why he did it. It is also hard not to see the pattern. Columbus believed that people could be guided by controlled information, that if he knew the larger purpose, he could bend the knowledge of others around it. On the ocean, that meant preventing mutiny. On land, later, it would mean claiming, taking, renaming, and explaining the world to people who had not asked for his explanation. But, for now, the lie was only numbers in a log. Below deck, life grew stale. The air was hot and damp. Bilge water shifted with the motion of the hull. Salt meat hung heavy with smell. Hard biscuit had to be tapped and inspected, because it was never only men who traveled on ships. Insects traveled. Mold traveled. Rats traveled if they could. A man trying to eat in the dark might make a small joke about not wanting his supper to walk away first. The others might laugh, not because it was very funny, but because laughter is sometimes the cheapest medicine aboard a crowded vessel. Sleep came badly. The deck was hard. The spaces below were close. A man could hear another man breathing beside him, muttering, turning, praying, dreaming of home. The constant motion entered the body until stillness itself became hard to imagine. Even when a sailor closed his eyes, the sea kept moving inside his bones. Day after day, nothing. The horizon remained empty. Then the weed began. At first it may have seemed like a sign of land. Floating green life on open water. Something torn from shore. Something carried outward by current. But the weed continued, wide mats of it, drifting brown and green across the surface. It brushed the hulls. It caught near the rudders. It made the sea look thick, as if the ocean were growing a skin. This was the Sargasso Sea, though the men did not have that calm modern name to comfort them. To them, it was wrong water. A meadow that could drown you. The ships slowed and pushed through it. Men leaned over the rails and watched the weed slide past, wondering if they were entering a place where ships stopped forever. The fear changed its clothing. Before, the fear had been falling off the edge of known distance. Now it became the fear of being trapped. The wind still pushed west. That was another trouble. A useful wind can become sinister if it never changes. The same force that carried them onward seemed to promise that they could never return. Men began to speak quietly of turning back, while turning back was still possible. Columbus reassured them. The winds would change. The seaweed meant nothing. Land was close. Signs were coming. He had the voice of a man who could not afford uncertainty. He had built his life toward this westward line. Behind him were years of begging in courts, rejections, debts, promises, calculations, and the eyes of monarchs waiting for profit. Ahead of him, he insisted, was Asha. Between those two things was the sea, and a crew beginning to doubt him. Late September passed with restless hope. Birds appeared. Not one bird, but several kinds, moving across the sky like living messages. Birds meant land. Every sailor knew this. Yet birds also mocked them, because birds could travel farther than exhausted men wanted to believe. A gull or a land bird might mean shore nearby, or it might mean shore still days away. Hope became another form of torment. The men searched the water for proof. A branch with leaves, a carved stick, a bit of wood worked by human hands. Small objects became enormous in meaning. A sailor might hold up a twig as if it were a royal decree. Look, land must be near. Another might say it was only drift. Another might say nothing at all, because he had spent too many hopes already. The eye began to invent coasts. Clouds became mountains. Mist became cliffs. The line where water met sky trembled with false promises. A man who had stared too long at emptiness could see almost anything there. The human mind paints when it is desperate, and not always honestly. By early October, patience thinned. The food was still there, but the calculation had changed. Every day west was another day that had to be sailed east, if east could be found at all. The men knew Columbus had promised a shorter route. They knew the days had already stretched beyond comfort. They knew that a captain who had been wrong about distance might also be wrong about salvation. The Pinzon brothers mattered then. Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, had local authority, seamanship, and the respect of men from Palos. His support helped keep the voyage together. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria were not only ships in formation. They were three small societies, each with its own nerves, loyalties, resentments, and whispered judgments. On October 10th, the pressure came close to rupture. The story is often told with clean dates and tidy phrases, but imagine the human feeling of it. Men with salt-cracked lips and sleepless eyes. Men who had crossed from doubt into anger because anger feels stronger. Men who had begun to think of home not as a place behind them, but as a thing stolen by one stubborn dreamer. A compromise emerged. A few more days. If land did not appear, they would turn back. Columbus accepted, or seemed to accept. We cannot hear his private thoughts. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps he did not. Perhaps he had already decided that return without discovery would be a kind of death, and that a captain can promise anything to calm a deck before continuing toward his own fate. October 11th came. The signs were suddenly everywhere. More birds. Fresh vegetation. A small branch with berries. Water that seemed lighter, shallower, more alive with nearby land. The men felt the change before they could name it. The air itself may have smelled different, carrying the green breath of an island not yet seen. Sailors know the sea through senses that maps cannot hold. A shift in bird flight, a change in floating weed, a tone in the water under the hull. As night fell, nobody slept easily. The ships moved through darkness with the strange caution of creatures approaching an unknown shore. The moonlight silvered the water. The sails rose pale against the sky. Men watched until their eyes hurt. Every shadow became possible land. Every low cloud was weighed and judged. Columbus later said he saw a light, a small flicker in the distance, rising and falling like a candle carried by a hand. He called others to witness it, but it vanished. Was it a real fire on shore? Was it a torch from the island? Was it imagination? Was it the mind of a man who needed to be first, even before dawn made firstness visible? We cannot know. A little after midnight, the ships continued on. Then, from the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana saw the thing that did not vanish. Land. A Paleline. A white cliff or beach shining under the moon. A darkness against the stars that held its shape. He cried out, and the cry crossed the water from ship to ship. Land. Land. The men woke as if pulled from underwater. Some stumbled, half-dressed. Some climbed. Some shouted. Some prayed. Columbus came on deck. The officers peered into the dark. It was there. Not cloud. Not weed. Not hope, pretending. Land. The reward promised to the first man who saw land should have belonged to Rodrigo. Later, Columbus claimed that his earlier light gave him priority. The reward passed to the admiral, not the lookout. It is a small moment, and yet it reveals something. Before any flag touched sand, Columbus had already learned how to take credit from those below him. The pattern begins quietly. Take the sign. Take the reward. Take the name. Take the land. But the men were too relieved to feel the full shape of it. They had survived. They had not vanished into the ocean. The West had given them shore. The ships waited for dawn. No one wanted to approach unknown reefs in darkness. The island ahead slept, or perhaps did not sleep at all. On shore, the Taino had likely seen the ships. 2 vessels, white wings, shapes beyond their experience. They watched from the land, trying to understand what had come out of the eastern sea. The Europeans waited offshore, thinking they had reached Asia. The Taino waited on land, seeing strangers whose arrival had no place in their old stories. Between them, the dark water moved gently. Morning had not yet made the misunderstanding visible. That pause is where the world changes most quietly, not in battle, not in thunder. In waiting, 3 ships rocking in moonlight, an island breathing in the dark. Men on both sides trying to fit the impossible into the shapes they already knew. History does not announce the size of itself at the door. It arrives as morning. The sky began to pale. The island ahead became green. The beach waited. The first boats would soon be lowered, and the sea that had separated 2 worlds for thousands of years would become a road. Morning revealed the island slowly. At first there was only shape, a darker green rising from a pale edge. Then the white of sand. Then the broken shine of water over reef. Then palms moving in a breeze the sailors could not yet feel. The island seemed to lift itself out of the dawn, fresh and impossible after so many days of ocean. The men on the ship stared. Some must have laughed. Some must have crossed themselves. Some may have wept quietly, turning their faces away. They had survived the sea. That was the first thought. Not history. Not conquest. not the planetary exchange of crops and diseases, only survival. The shore was not empty. From the forest, the Taino watched. They had likely seen the ships the day before, or at least the strange pale shapes offshore in the darkness. Nothing in their experience looked like these vessels. Their own canoes were great and skillful, some large enough to carry many people, carved from single massive trees, shaped by fire and stone and long knowledge of Caribbean water. But these ships were different, built up from many pieces, tall-sided, winged with cloth, groaning like wooden animals. Their sails caught the wind in a way that must have seemed almost alive. Imagine standing among the trees. The air smells of leaves, warm earth, salt, flowers, and morning water. Insects move in the heat beginning to rise. Behind you are houses, gardens, kinne, ancestors, paths you know by foot and memory. Ahead, in the bright water, 3 impossible things rest beyond the reef. Smaller boats are being lowered from them. Men are climbing down, pale, skinned, bearded, layered in cloth and metal, even though the air is warm enough for the body to breathe freely. Some watching may have wanted to run. Some may have wanted to meet them. Some may have wondered whether they were spirits, traitors, enemies, or simply lost people who had come very far and did not yet know how to behave. The leaders chose to wait and watch. That is an important kindness in this story. The Taino did not rush blindly. They did not become the childish figures that old European accounts sometimes imagined. They observed. They judged. They tried to understand the arrival of something new, using the tools of a world that had never needed to imagine Europe. On the ships, the Europeans prepared their own theater. Columbus dressed for ceremony. Armor, good clothes, royal standard. The captains took banners marked with crosses and the signs of Ferdinand and Isabella. The boats moved toward shore, oars dipping into clear water. Fish flashed beneath them. The sand ahead shone in the morning light. When Columbus stepped into the surf, warm water folded around his legs. The same man who had hidden distances in his logs now carried the authority of Spain in his hands. Behind him came men with banners. The cloth lifted in the sea breeze. Metal caught the sun. Boots sunk into wet sand. Then he performed a ritual of possession. He planted flags. He spoke formal words in Spanish. He declared the island claimed for the Spanish crown. The Taino watching from the trees did not understand the words. They could not know that a ceremony had just attempted to transform their home into property of distant monarchs. They could not know that European legal imagination had developed a method by which land inhabited by non-Christians could be claimed through proclamation, symbol, and papal authority. It is one of the darkest absurdities in human history. A man stands on a beach where people already live, speaks words they cannot understand, raises a flag they did not invite, and believes that reality has changed. Imagine the reverse. A Taino canoe reaches Spain. A chief plants a carved staff, speaks in his own language, and declares Seville now belongs to Guanahani. the Spanish would not have called that law. Yet when Europeans performed the ritual in the Americas, they called it discovery. This is how power often begins. Not with honesty, but with a sentence spoken in the wrong language to the wrong people, then recorded by the people holding the weapons. And yet, the morning itself did not look like conquest. It looked almost gentle. The Taino began to emerge from the trees, slowly at first. Hands open, bodies relaxed but watchful. They brought gifts, parrots bright as pieces of living sky, balls of cotton thread, small carved things, perhaps bits of gold worked into ornaments, perhaps food, perhaps simple offerings of welcome. Hospitality mattered in their world. Strangers, even strange strangers, could be met with generosity while their meaning was tested. The Spanish answered with beads. Glass beads, red and bright, hawk bells of brass that chimed with a tiny metallic sound. Things cheap in European ports, but beautiful and strange to people who did not make glass or brass bells. The Taino were delighted by them. And why not? A bead does not reveal the price system that made it cheap elsewhere. A bell does not tell you that the giver thinks he has cheated you. It only shines. It only rings. For a little while, both sides may have felt successful. The Taino received wonderful new objects. The Spanish received cotton, barats, ornaments, information, and the first hints of gold. But Columbus saw more than exchange. In his journal, he began to calculate. He noticed that the people were generous. He noticed they seemed peaceful. He noticed that they did not carry iron weapons. He noticed that they were willing to trade valuable things for trifles. He wrote that they would make good servants, that they could be converted, that with a small number of armed men they could be subdued. There is the shadow under the sunlight. The qualities that made the Taino humane to strangers: openness, curiosity, generosity, became in the eyes of Columbus signs of vulnerability. Their hospitality entered his mind not as a gift, but as weakness to be used. I have always found that first day hard to sit with, because outwardly it is almost beautiful. Warm water, green island, people smiling without a shared language, beads in open hands, parrots calling, men who had been afraid of drowning now standing on land. There may even have been laughter. The Spanish clothing alone must have looked absurd in the Caribbean warmth. Heavy cloth, metal, huts, boots, formal gestures, all of it under a sun that quietly suggested fewer layers. The Taino likely noticed how little these visitors knew of the place. The Europeans had metal and ships, yes, but they could not read the island. That contrast matters. The Spanish looked powerful, and in some ways they were. Steel blades, crossbows, ships, writing, royal backing, and the confidence of a civilization that believed possession could be spoken into existence. Yet on that beach they were also helpless. They did not know the reefs, plants, seasons, languages, politics, spirits, kinship lines, or rules of courtesy. They were impressive and ignorant at once. The Taino looked gentle to Columbus, and in some ways they were. Their society valued generosity and hospitality, but they were not simple, not empty, not waiting. Their world had chiefs, healers, seafarers, farmers, artists, ceremonies, rivalries, alliance, stories, and ancestors. Neither side understood the other. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia. He looked for the great Khan behind every horizon. He thought the people before him might be subjects of distant Asian rulers, or at least near lands full of gold and spices. He carried letters for political worlds that were not there. He saw the island through Marco Polo and royal contracts. The Taino likely believed these visitors would trade, perhaps move on, perhaps become allies, perhaps become a danger to be managed like other dangers. They did not know that Europe had arrived as a system, not only as 3 ships. They could not see the monarchs, investors, priests, documents, armies, diseases, animals, crops, and hunger that stood invisibly behind those beads. The first contact was many misunderstandings happening at the same time. A legal claim misunderstood as ceremony. A gift misunderstood as weakness. A welcome misunderstood as surrender. A land inhabited for generations misunderstood as available. Columbus gave the island a Christian name, San Salvador. The people already had a name for it, Guanahani. Naming is never innocent in stories like this. To name a place can be an act of love, but it can also be an act of possession. A new name placed over an old name is like a cloth laid over a face. The face is still there, but the stranger sees only what he has brought. Soon, Columbus would move on. He was not satisfied. The island was beautiful, but beauty was not enough. He needed gold, spices, proof, ossia. The small ornaments worn by some Taino people became clues to him, shining breadcrumbs leading somewhere richer. Through gestures and fragments, he heard directions toward other islands, south and west. Cuba, perhaps. A word in a Taino mouth became a shape inside the European imagination. He would begin to island hop, naming as he went, claiming as he went, taking people as guides, turning hospitality into resource. But before we follow him away from Guanahani, we should stay a little longer with the people he failed to see. Because the Caribbean was not an empty stage waiting for European history to begin. It was already alive with history. The Taino world stretched across islands in a network of kinship, trade, travel, memory, and ceremony. Their canoes linked communities across blue water. Their gardens fed villages through storms and seasons. Their leaders ruled through generosity, ritual power, kinship, and ability. Their spiritual world filled trees, stones, ancestors, houses, rivers, and carved sacred objects with presence. Columbus saw nakedness and thought simplicity. He saw generosity and thought obedience. He saw little gold and imagined mines. He saw people, but his ambition translated them into labor, converts, gid, and signs. That is the tragedy beginning on the beach. Not only violence, though violence would come. Not only disease, though disease would come with terrible quiet. The first tragedy was misreading. To look at a whole civilization and see only what can be used. The sun climbed higher. The sand warmed. The ships rested offshore like wooden strangers. The Taino returned to their villages, carrying beads and bells. Perhaps speaking quickly, laughing, wondering, worrying. The Spanish returned to their boats, carrying gifts, information, and the first taste of a hunger that would not be satisfied. Behind them, the flags stood in sand. The words of possession had been spoken. The island wind moved through palms that did not know they had been renamed. And the day that began with wonder had already bent itself toward empire. Before we follow Columbus away from that first beach, we need to let the island breathe by itself, not as a backdrop for European arrival, not as an empty place waiting for a flag, not as a simple paradise, soft and silent, ready to be named by strangers. Guanahani was part of a living world, a Caribbean world made of islands, currents, gardens, kinship, memory, and sea roads. The people Columbus met were not standing at the beginning of history. They were standing in the middle of their own. The Taino world was wide. It stretched across the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and many smaller islands, not as one empire with a single ruler on a high throne, but as a network of communities bound together by families, marriages, trade, ceremonies, rivalries, obligation, and stories. It was a civilization of water as much as land. To understand it, we should not imagine hard borders drawn on maps. We should imagine routes, canoe routes, blue roads, paths across reefs and open channels where people had traveled for generations. A Taino canoe could be a remarkable thing. Some were small and swift, made for fishing near shore. Others were large enough to carry many people, carved from the trunk of a great tree. The making of one began long before it touched water. A tree was chosen with care, often a ceiba or cotton tree, large, sacred, and alive with meaning. The work was slow. Fire softened the wood. Stone tools shaped it. Hands scraped, smoothed, hollowed, tested, and returned again the next day. Imagine the smell of it. Warm wood, smoke, sap, wet leaves. Men and women moving around the work with patient attention. Children watching from the edge, pretending not to be fascinated. Someone laughing when a tool slips. Someone telling an old story about a voyage made by a grandfather, or a storm survived by a chief who knew how to read clouds. A canoe was not only transport, it was memory given shape. With canoes, islands were not prisons. They were connected rooms in a house of water. Trade goods moved across astonishing distances. Stone from one island appeared on another. Shell ornaments traveled. Pottery styles spread and changed. News moved. Marriage ties moved. Warnings moved. If a storm struck one island and ruined gardens, relatives elsewhere could help. This was survival designed through relationship. The Caribbean is beautiful, yes, but beauty can be harsh. Hurricanes come, drought comes, the sea gives and takes. A people who live there for centuries do not survive by being simple. They survive by learning the moods of water, wind, root, soil, and season. The Taino learned well. Their main food was cassava, also called yucca, a root that grows in poor soil and survives where many crops would fail. But cassava carries danger inside it. Prepared carelessly, it can poison the body. The Taino did not merely discover a crop. They mastered a process. They grated the root. They pressed out the bitter juice through woven strainers. They dried the pulp. They baked it into flat bread that could last for months. That bread, kasabi, was quiet technology. No iron needed. No plow. No mill wheel. Only knowledge carried by hands and taught through repetition. A child might watch an elder grate the root, see the liquid drawn away, smell the baking bread, and learn without being told that food is not only found, food is transformed. Safety is made. Their fields were carefully designed. Mounded gardens called conucos lifted crops above wet ground and improved drainage. They grew sweet potatoes, beans, peppers, peanuts, maize, pineapple, and other plants that made the villages resilient. The gardens were not European fields cut into long, straight wounds. They were more like living mosaics, many crops sharing the same space, each one helping the others in ways learned over time. Columbus saw no wheat, no oxen, no iron plows, and thought the world before him was lacking. He did not understand that absence is not always poverty. A place can be rich without looking like Europe. The Taino had art, and the art was not separate from spirit. They carved stone, shell, bone, and wood into forms that held meaning. Their zimas, sacred objects linked with ancestors, gos, and forces of the unseen world, could be small enough to carry or large enough to command a room. Some had faces with wide eyes and crouched bodies. Some seemed to rest between human and animal, between object and presence. A zemi was not decoration. It was a place where the invisible could lean close. Chiefs kept powerful zemis. Healers and ritual specialists worked with them. Families honored ancestors through them. A polished surface, touched by many hands, could gather the feeling of generations. To a European who did not understand, such objects might look like idols or curiosities. To the Taino, they were relationships. Their world was full of presence. A river could hold spirit. A cave could hold origin. A tree could be more than wood. The dead were not simply gone. They remained near through story, ritual, and memory. In some traditions, the first people emerged from caves. In others, waters once burst forth and shaped the islands. The living world and the spirit world were not sealed away from each other. They met in ceremony, dream, healing, in carved form. Leadership also worked differently from what Columbus expected. A cacique was a chief, but not a king in the European sense. Authority depended on lineage. Yes, but also on generosity, spiritual strength, skill in keeping peace, success in feeding people, and the ability to hold alliances. A leader who failed could lose respect. Power had to be maintained through giving as well as command. This matters because Columbus saw openness and assumed weakness. A generous leader was not a fool. A hospitable village was not an undefended treasure chest. Hospitality itself was part of order. It revealed status. It tested strangers. It showed that the community had enough to share and enough confidence to welcome before striking. Women held significant roles too. Some women became caciques. Others served as healers and spiritual workers. Women cultivated, processed food, shaped family alliances, carried memory, and held authority in ways European observers often failed to recognize because they had brought their own limits with them. When an outsider sees only what his own world has trained him to value, whole lives become invisible. The villages themselves were organized and alive with craft. Imagine one at evening. Houses built from wood, thatch, and woven materials stand around open spaces. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Cassava bread cools. Children run between doorways. At dog box, someone repairs a net. Someone shapes a shell ornament. In the plaza, older people talk while the light lowers. The air smells of roasting food, damp earth, leaves, and sea salt. There may be a ball court nearby, a place for games that are also ceremony, competition, display, and social memory. Rubber balls move through air. Bodies turn. People cheer. The game is not a simple pastime. It belongs to ritual life, to community, to rhythm. A village with time for games is a village with food systems, social order, and shared meaning strong enough to support more than bare survival. That is what Columbus did not see. Or perhaps worse, he saw pieces of it and translated them poorly. He saw cotton and thought trade. He saw gold ornaments and thought mines. He saw nakedness and thought innocence. He saw lack of iron and thought weakness. He saw generosity and thought servants. He saw people smiling and began measuring how easily they could be ruled. There is a tragedy in that kind of seeing. It is not blindness exactly. It is sight bent by hunger. The Taino were not one simple people without conflict. They had politics. They had rivalries. They knew danger. Some communities faced pressure from Carib groups from the south. Chiefs had alliances and enemies. Islands had histories of migration, tension, and exchange. People argued. People loved. People envied. People joked. People mourned. A potter could be proud of a vessel. A child could be bored during a ceremony. A healer could doubt a remedy in the privacy of her own heart. Human life was as full there as anywhere. That fullness is important to hold before the loss begins. Because when historians say a population declined, the words can become too clean. Declined sounds like a line on a chart. But a decline is a grandmother not hearing her language from the next room. A canoe not finished, a garden untended, a song no longer taught correctly, Azemi hidden, broken, or carried away, a child renamed by strangers, a village path growing over because the feet that made it are gone. On October 12th, 1492, none of that was visible yet. The people of Guanahani were still in their own mourning. They still knew the names of beaches, reefs, and trees. They still knew who owed whom a favor, which relatives lived across water, where cassava grew best, which stories belonged to caves, which chiefs could be trusted, which winds meant weather. Their world was not ending in their eyes. It was being interrupted by visitors. And the first response, at least on that beach, was not hatred. It was curiosity. It was caution. It was gift. That may be the part that hurts most. They met strangers, as humans often hope to be met, with open hands, with attention, with enough trust to begin. The Spanish received that trust through the filter of appetite. Columbus wrote of their gentleness and immediately imagined how to use it. A bell in a Taino hand, a parrot in a Spanish hand, a bead catching sunlight, a word misunderstood, a gesture taken for agreement, a whole future bending quietly in the heat. Now Columbus was ready to leave the first island. He had seen beauty, but not enough gold. He had received welcome, but not enough wealth. The small ornaments worn by some Taino people became clues, and clues became obsession. Through gestures, fragments, and desire, he heard directions toward other islands. The people pointed south and west, or seemed to. Maybe they wanted to help. Maybe they wanted the strangers to move on. Maybe they were simply answering questions whose danger they could not yet know. Columbus listened with the ear of a man who already knew what he wanted the answer to mean. Somewhere beyond, there had to be gold. Somewhere beyond, there had to be Asia. Somewhere beyond, the world he had promised Spain would finally appear. So the ships lifted anchor again. The beach grew smaller behind them. The Taino returned to their villages with beads and stories. The Spanish sailed away with captives, names, guesses, and a hunger that had only sharpened. The island world remained bright around them. But the first taking had begun. Columbus did not linger where there was no treasure. That sounds harsh, but it is the pulse of his journal after the first landing. The island was green. The people were kind. The water was clear. The air was warm. And none of that was enough. Beauty was not proof. Hospitality was not profit. He needed gold, spices, cities, signs of Asia, something heavy enough to carry back across the ocean and place before Ferdinand and Isabella as vindication. So he moved. The ships passed from island to island through the Bahamas, white beaches and green interiors appearing and falling away like dreams. Columbus named them as he went. Christian names, royal names, Spanish names, placed over older names that had lived in local mouths for generations. Naming became another form of taking. Not as loud as a weapon, not as visible as chain, but powerful all the same. Arrive, claim, rename. Move on. It is one of the earliest rhythms of empire. The Taino guides who traveled with him did not join as free ambassadors in the way a gentle painting might suggest. Columbus had taken people from their homes to serve as interpreters, guide, and proof. He needed their bodies to open doors he did not understand. He needed their gestures, their pointing hands, their partial words, their knowledge of currents and islands. The word took is so small. History often hides inside small words. He took guides. He took possession. He took names. He took the reward from Rodrigo. Each taking made the next one easier. The Taino tried to answer his questions. Where is the gold? Where are the larger islands? Where are the rulers? Through gestures and fragments, they pointed elsewhere. South, west, another island, a bigger land. Perhaps they truly knew of places where gold was more common. Perhaps they were trying to satisfy the visitors. Perhaps they were trying, very sensibly, to send the armed strangers away from their own villages. We cannot know. But Columbus heard what he needed. Tuba. To him, that word began to glow. It became not simply an island, but a possible doorway into the Asia of his imagination. He carried Marco Polo in his mind like a second map. Japan, China, islands rich with gold, courts of the Great Khan, silk, spices, palaces, and officials who would receive the letters he had brought from Spain. Reality kept refusing to match that map. Columbus kept pressing the map harder. On October 28, 1492, he reached Cuba. The coast stretched wider than the smaller islands. It did not end quickly. It ran along the horizon with a seriousness that made him feel confirmed. This, surely, was no small island. This could be the mainland of Asia. This could be China, or near China, or near Japan. The exactness mattered less than the need. The land was beautiful. Forests, rivers, harbors, warm air, birds, and village. The Spanish sent men inland. They expected some hint of Asia. Cities, markets, officials, silk robes, temples, perhaps messengers of the Great Khan. What they found were Taino communities, tobacco, agriculture, cotton, gardens, and people who received them with curiosity. No palaces of gold, no Chinese court, no Asian empire. The scouts returned with ordinary truth, and Columbus translated it into extraordinary expectation. The great cities must be farther inland. The gold must be nearby. The signs must mean what he had promised they would mean. He wrote as if Cuba belonged to the edge of the old Asian world, because admitting otherwise would have meant admitting that his whole geography had broken open beneath him. You know that feeling when someone has made a mistake too large to admit. So, every new fact becomes evidence that the mistake is somehow not a mistake. That is Columbus along the coast of Cuba. The island speaks Caribbean. He insists on hearing Asia. For weeks, he sailed along the northern coast. Harbors pleased him. Rivers pleased him. trees pleased him. He praised the beauty of the land again and again, and then turned immediately back toward gold. His eyes moved through paradise searching for metal. The men felt it too. They had crossed the ocean for reward. They had been promised wealth, advancement, maybe glory. So far they had found islands, food, friendly people, small ornaments, and no treasure large enough to silence complaint. A voyage that begins as wonder can quickly become accounting. Then the guides pointed east, toward another island, Hispaniola. The name would come later. The Taino had their own names, and different communities used different words for their lands. Columbus heard enough to believe that this larger island held more gold. And this time, unlike the smaller islands, there was visible proof. People wore more gold ornaments. Streams carried gold dust. Stories spoke of places inland where the yellow metal could be found. Columbus changed. Hope returned to him like fever. On December 6th, 1492, he reached Hispaniola. The island rose from the sea with mountains, valleys, rivers, and a richness that seemed to answer the demands of his imagination. Here, perhaps, was the proof. Not the palaces of Japan, not the courts of China, but enough gold to make Spain listen. Enough promise to make the voyage a success. The first meetings were again marked by exchange. Taino communities approached with curiosity and caution. Gifts passed. Food was given. Small ornaments were shown. Columbus praised the people in one line and calculated their subjugation in the next. He noticed their generosity, then imagined control. He noticed their gold, then imagined mines. He noticed their lack of European weapons, then imagined conquest with a small force. The tone darkened. His men began ranging farther. Questions became pressure. Curiosity became demand. The island was no longer only a place to admire. It was a place to extract from. The Spanish were tired, hungry for reward, and armed with the belief that their king, queen, church, and God stood behind them. The Taino still had political agency. They were not passive figures waiting for tragedy. Local leaders weighed alliances. Some saw advantage in friendship with the newcomers. Some saw danger. Some may have hoped to use the Spanish against rivals. Some may have believed the visitors would leave after trading, as travelers often do. One leader, Guanahani, formed a friendly connection with Columbus. His people helped the Spanish, brought food, exchanged gifts, and showed hospitality. Columbus saw in him an ally, perhaps even the beginning of a local client ruler under Spanish influence. Guanahani likely saw something more complex, a way to manage strangers, gain prestige, and protect his community through controlled friendship. Then, on Christmas Eve, the flagship failed. The Santa Maria ran aground. Not in a storm, not in a glorious disaster, but in almost embarrassing quiet. Columbus, exhausted, had gone to sleep. A young or inexperienced hand was left at the helm. The waters off Hispaniola were calm. The ship drifted. Coral waited below. Then came the slow grinding of wood against reef. Imagine waking to that sound. Not thunder, not splintering all at once. A scrape, a shudder, a heavy, wrong pause in the motion of the vessel. Men stumble up. Voices rise. The ship is caught. The largest vessel of the fleet, the Admiral flagship, the proud carrier of his westward dream, is stuck fast in Caribbean water. By morning, it is clear she will not sail again. Christmas morning, 1492. Columbus stands before ruin, but he refuses to see only ruin. He sees materials. The Taino helps salvage the wreck. Their canoes move back and forth between ship and shore. Cargo comes off. Barrels, tools, weapons, stores, planks, beams. The Santa Maria is dismantled piece by piece, turning from ship into timber. What carried Europe across the sea becomes wood on a beach. From that wreckage, Columbus builds a fort. La Navidad, the Nativity, a birth made from a shipwreck. It was small, a palisade, rough buildings, a storehouse, a little armed foothold placed in the middle of a living Taino world. To Columbus, it was proof that Spain now had a presence across the Atlantic. To the Taino, it may have seemed like a strange guest compound, temporary perhaps, inconvenient perhaps, but not yet the beginning of everything that would follow. Columbus had a practical problem. The Santa Maria was gone, and the remaining ships could not carry everyone back. So he left 39 men behind. The number sounds precise and lonely. 39 men, suddenly made into the first European settlement in the Caribbean. Sailors, craftsmen, lower officers, restless men, ambitious men, perhaps troublesome men Columbus did not mind leaving. Men told to keep peace, gather gold, obey appointed leaders, and wait for his return. He promised them opportunity, gold, land, status, a future. It must have sounded intoxicating to some of them. Stay here, in this warm island world, among people who had so far fed and helped them, and perhaps become rich before the next fleet returned. A poor sailor could imagine becoming someone important. The mind can build castles very quickly when gold is mentioned. Columbus gave instructions. Do not mistreat the Taino. Do not wander too far. Obey. Keep order. Prepare for the return. Then he sailed away. Picture the moment from the shore. The Nina and the Pinta lifting into the morning wind. The sails filling. The ships growing smaller. The 39 men watching as the last familiar authority recedes into blue distance. Behind them, the fort smells of fresh-cut timber and salt. Around them are villages, fields, canoes, languages they do not understand, customs they do not understand, politics they do not understand. They have weapons, yes. They have confidence, yes. They also have very little wisdom about the world that now holds them. The island remains. The ships vanish. La Navidad is alone. Columbus sailed east with captives, pirates, Plans, small gold pieces, reports, promises, and the story he wanted Europe to hear. He left behind not a stable colony, but a question built of wreckwood. Could a handful of armed strangers live peacefully among people they already saw as exploitable? Could greed be restrained by instructions given from a departing ship? Could hospitality survive under the pressure of men who believed gold was hidden somewhere nearby? The answer waited in silence. For now, La Navidad stood in the heat. Its fresh-cut timbers dried in the sun. The sea moved softly below the palisade. Taino villages continued their own rhythms nearby. Gardens, fides, canoes, voices, children, ceremonies. The Spanish men watched the horizon where their ships had vanished. The island remained itself. But something had been planted in it now. Not only a fort, a claim, a hunger, a beginning that already carried the shape of its ruin. The ocean did not welcome Columbus home gently. When he left Hispaniola in January of 1493, the Santa Maria was gone. 39 men remained at La Navidad, and the 2 surviving ships carried more than cargo. They carried parrots, cotton, small pieces of gold, strange plants, several Taino captives, and the first written claims that Spain had found a doorway to wealth beyond the Western Sea. They also carried fear. The Atlantic, that had seemed almost kind on the westward voyage, changed its face on the return. Winter water rose around the Nina and the Pinta. Clouds gathered like iron plates. Wind struck the sails with a force that made every rope sing. The ships climbed dark waves and dropped into troughs where the horizon vanished. Wood groaned. Men prayed. Barrels shifted. Cold spray crossed the deck and left faces raw with salt. Columbus had crossed the ocean once by stubbornness, luck, shill, and error. Now the ocean seemed ready to erase the proof. If the ships sank, the story sank with them. Europe would not know. Ferdinand and Isabella would not know. His enemies would say he had vanished into foolishness. The islands, the Taino, the gold hints, the western route, the claim of discovery, all of it could disappear into water with no witness except the sea. So, in the storm, Columbus wrote, "There is something almost strange and human in that image. A man surrounded by waves sits with paper, ink, and desperate purpose. The lamp tremble. The ship lurches. His hand must steady itself while the hull complains around him. Outside, sailors fight wind and water. Inside, Columbus fights oblivion. He writes descriptions of islands. He writes of gentle people. He writes of gold. Always gold. Sometimes more promised than proven. He writes of conversion, of lands waiting for Christian rule, of harbors and trees and possibilities. He writes himself into the center of the storm, because legacy is another kind of shore. Some accounts say he sealed copies of his report in barrels and cast them into the sea, hoping that if the ship broke apart, the words might float toward land. Imagine that. A barrel rising and falling on black water, carrying not food, not rescue, but a claim on history. A little wooden ark for ambition. The ships survived. The Pinta separated in the storm. The Nina struggled onward. Columbus reached the Azores, then Portugal, then Spain. The sea had tried to make him a rumor. Instead, he arrived as news. And news in 1493 could travel faster than ships once printers caught it. His letter spread through Europe in copies and translations. Barcelona, Rome, Basel, Paris, and other cities carried his story through print. The voyage became a thing people could hold in their hands. A pamphlet, a report, a marvel, a promise. People who had never seen the ocean read about islands of warm air, green trees, generous inhabitants, and gold somewhere just beyond the next hill. It was part observation, part advertisement. Columbus knew how to describe opportunity. He wrote of the Taino as open, obedient, lacking iron weapons, easy to convert, easy to command. He wrote of land that seemed fertile and rich. He wrote as if Asia had been touched at last, even though what he had touched was not Asia at all. He did not understand the geography, but he understood the hunger of Europe. Europe heard what it wanted. When Columbus arrived before Ferdinand and Isabella, he did not come empty-handed. He brought parrots with bright feathers, cotton, blunts, little gold objects, and human beings taken from their islands. The Taino captives stood in courts of stone and cloth and ceremony, far from warm beaches, far from their families, surrounded by people who looked at them as proof. That is one of the quiet cruelties of the return. The captives were not treated as full messengers from a sovereign world. They were signs, living evidence, bodies made to confirm a story told by the man who had taken them. Some were baptized. Some were renamed, their own names, spoken by kin beside Caribbean water, were covered by Christian names given under foreign roofs. To European observers, it looked like wonder. To the people brought there, it must have felt closer to being swallowed by another world. Columbus knelt before the monarchs. He spoke of islands. He spoke of people ready for conversion. He spoke of riches that would surely come. He presented himself as the admiral who had opened the Western Road. Ferdinand and Isabella listened with the attention of rulers who had just finished one great project and now sensed another beginning. Spain had taken Granada. Spain had expelled those it wished to exclude. Spain had emptied treasure into war and now looked outward for replenishment. The return of Columbus offered a future wrapped in providence and profit. But empires do not grow from stories alone. They require documents, blessings, legal fictions, lines drawn by people far from the lands those lines will wound. Rome entered quickly. Pope Alexander VI issued papal bulls in 1493, granting Spain broad rights over lands west of a proposed line, so long as those lands were brought into the Christian fold. The language was sacred. The logic was imperial. Lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples could be assigned by distant authority to Christian monarchs who had never seen them. Ink crossed the sea before armies did. Portugal objected, because Portugal had its own claims and ambitions. So Spain and Portugal negotiated. In 1494, The Treaty of Tordesillas moved the line and divided much of the non-European world between them, at least in their own imagination. They drew a boundary across an earth they did not understand, over peoples who had not been asked, through lands whose size, history, and complexity were invisible to the men holding the pens. That is how quietly catastrophe can begin. Not always with a sword. Sometimes with a map table, wax seals, serious faces, and men saying leagues as if numbers could make theft lawful. Back in Spain, the second voyage took shape. This time, it was not 3 small ships and 90 men. This time, it was a fleet. 17 ships. More than 1,000 people. Sailors, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, officials, animals, seeds, tools, weapons, expectations, hunger, and the hardening confidence of a kingdom that now believed there was land to occupy. The first voyage had been a gamble. The second was colonization. That shift matters more than almost any single event. Spain sent the machinery of settlement. Horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, sugarcane, priests, iron, legal authority, armed men who expected reward, men who had read or heard Columbus' promises and wanted their share before the next man took it. The ships became vessels of biology as well as empire. This is the hidden story under the flags. The Columbian Exchange, a name that sounds almost polite, almost like merchants swapping goods at a market. But it was far more than trade. It was the joining of 2 biological worlds that had been separated for thousands of years. Plants crossed. Animals crossed. Microbes crossed. Weeds crossed. Rats crossed. Ideas crossed. Hunger crossed. Immunities did not cross evenly. From Europe and Africa and Asia came horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, sugarcane, and other crops and animals that changed landscapes. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, cassava, tobacco, and foods that transformed diets across the world. So much of the modern kitchen is an archive of this collision. But the darkest travelers were invisible. Disease moved in breath, cloth, skin, fever, and touch. Smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, typhus, other infections whose names shifted across reports and memories. Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the Americas had no prior exposure to many Eurasian diseases. Their communities had not built generations of partial immunity through repeated epidemics. When these pathogens arrived, they did not behave like ordinary visitors. They moved like fire through dry grass. We should speak carefully here. Population estimates are debated. The numbers vary. But the broad truth is not debated in its sorrow. Disease, combined with violence, forced labor, hunger, displacement, enslavement, and social collapse, devastated indigenous populations on a scale difficult to hold in the mind. The Taino would be among the first to suffer the full weight of it. Before that weight fully fell, the second fleet crossed the Atlantic with confidence. Imagine those ships approaching Hispaniola. Men crowding rails. Horses shifting below. Pigs restless. Barrels of seed and food. Priests ready to save souls. Soldiers ready to take. Officials ready to record. A whole little Europe carried in wooden hulls. And on shore, La Navidad should have been waiting. The fort built from the Santa Maria. The 39 men. The first European foothold. The proof that settlement could begin. But when Columbus returned in late 1493, La Navidad was silent. The palisade was ruined. The men were gone. No cheerful greeting. No gold piled in storehouses. No confident little colony ready to praise his name. Only charred remains, scattered objects, and explanations that came through fear, politics, translation, and suspicion. Guanahani, the Taino leader who had first allied with Columbus, said another chief had attacked. He showed wounds, perhaps real, perhaps emphasized, perhaps both. The Spanish suspected betrayal. Later accounts suggest the men left behind may have abused local people, wandered inland, demanded women and gold, fought among themselves, and made enemies faster than they made sense. Disease may have played a part. Internal conflict may have played a part. Taino resistance almost certainly played a part. We cannot reconstruct every final hour. La Navidad disappeared into the kind of uncertainty that surrounds small, violent beginnings. But the meaning was clear enough. The first settlement had failed. The first attempt at foothold had become a warning. The Spanish did not interpret it as a reason to withdraw. They interpreted it as a reason to harden. The new settlement would not be a rough little fort of 39 men. It would be larger, more controlled, more hungry, more violent. The ocean had brought Columbus home as a hero, carried his words through Europe, invited princes and priests into the story, opened the gates to papal lines and royal claims, and sent back a fleet. Now that fleet had found the first colony dead. A softer path, if one had ever existed, was closing. Ahead lay La Isabela, tribute, forced labor, disease, and the slow breaking of a world that had welcomed strangers with open hands. La Isabela was built from disappointment. Columbus had returned with a fleet large enough to make the first voyage look like a whisper. 17 ships, more than 1,000 people, animals, seeds, tools, weapons, priests, officials, and men whose minds were already crowded with gold. They had crossed the ocean expecting opportunity. They found, instead, the ruins of La Navidad, a hostile uncertainty, and an island that refused to become the easy treasure house Columbus had promised. So they built. On the northern coast of Hispaniola, they began a new settlement named for Queen Isabella. The place was poorly chosen. The soil nearby was not as generous as they needed. Fresh water was not ideal. Heat, hunger, insects, unfamiliar diseases, and frustration settled over the colony like a damp cloth. Men who had imagined fortunes found themselves cutting wood, hauling supplies, digging, sweating, and waiting for gold that did not appear in the quantities promised. A colony can fail before its walls are finished. You can hear it in the small sounds. A hammer falling too slowly because the hand is weak. A man coughing under a roof that leaks. Animals restless in pens. Barrels opened and found spoiled. Priests saying prayers over men who had not expected paradise to smell of fever and mud. The sea behind them no longer looked like adventure. It looked like the long road back to disappointment. Columbus was not built for steady governance. He was a navigator, a persuader, a dreamer of routes, a man capable of endurance and daring. But ruling a colony required patience, fairness, food management, diplomacy, restraint, and the ability to see people as more than instruments. Those were not his strengths. The Spanish wanted gold. The crown wanted profit. The investors wanted return. Columbus needed proof that he had not oversold the Western Islands. The pressure turned downward, onto the Taino. What had begun as exchange became demand. Demand became tribute. Taino communities were ordered to bring gold, cotton, food, and labor. In regions where gold existed only in small amounts, impossible quotas became traps. People were pushed from gardens, rivers, families, and ceremonies into systems designed for extraction. When tribute could not be met, punishment followed. When food production was disrupted, hunger followed. When hunger came, disease found easier doors. We should not make the catastrophe too simple. Disease alone did not destroy the Taino world. Violence alone did not destroy it. Forced labor alone did not destroy it. It was the convergence. Pathogens entering bodies with no inherited defenses. Fields neglected because people were made to work elsewhere. Villages broken apart. Leaders displaced or forced into impossible alliances. Spiritual systems mocked or attacked. Families separated. Food stores strained by colonists. Fear spreading faster than any official order. The old island networks, once resilient against storms, were now facing something they had not evolved to absorb. The numbers are debated, and they should be handled carefully. Some early European accounts exaggerate. Some undercount. Some write from guilt, others from greed. But even cautious estimates recognize a collapse so immense that ordinary language becomes too small. Hispaniola may have held hundreds of thousands of Taino people, perhaps more than 1 million according to some estimates. Within decades, the population was shattered. Behind every number was a face. A woman who knew the right moment to lift cassava bread from the heat. A canoe maker who could read the grain of a tree. A child who knew which reef held fish after rain. A healer who remembered which leaves cooled fever. When they died, were enslaved, fled, hid, or were renamed by colonial systems. Knowledge moved with them, sometimes lost, sometimes changed, sometimes carried quietly where officials failed to see it. This is why the old phrase that the Taino disappeared is too simple. Many died. Whole communities were broken. Languages and ceremonial systems suffered devastation. But disappearance is often a word empires use when they stop recognizing the people they damaged. Taino ancestry, words, foodways, memory, and identity survived in fragments and in living descendants. Survival did not look like the old world untouched. It looked like embers under ash. Meanwhile, Columbus' rule grew harsher and less stable. Spanish colonists complained too. They were hungry, sick, angry, and disappointed. Many had come for wealth, not discipline. They resisted work. They blamed Columbus. Columbus blamed disobedience, local people, scarcity, and betrayal. His brothers took authority in his name. Punishments multiplied. Order became cruelty, and cruelty failed to create order. The dream of Asia still clung to him, even as he governed Hispaniola badly, even as reports of misrule reached Spain, even as other navigators began to understand that these lands were not the eastern edge of Asia. Columbus held to his interpretation. He had crossed the ocean to prove a route, and the mind sometimes protects its life, work, like a mother protecting a child, even when the child is made of error. The crown began to doubt. Complaints traveled back across the Atlantic. Colonists accused Columbus and his brothers of tyranny, incompetence, favoritism, and harsh punishments. The wealth promised had not arrived in satisfying quantities. The colony was unstable. Indigenous suffering was becoming impossible to hide, though not impossible for officials to excuse when profit called loudly enough. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla arrived with royal authority to investigate. The man who had once returned to Spain as an admiral of wonder now faced inquiry. Bobadilla heard complaints, saw disorder, and acted decisively. Columbus and his brothers were arrested. Columbus was placed in chains and sent back across the same ocean that had carried his glory. There is a cruel symmetry in that image. The first return, parrots, captives, gold hints, applause, royal attention. The later return, shame, accusation, failure, the creak of a ship no longer carrying a triumphant admiral, but a disgraced governor. Columbus reportedly kept the chains after they were removed, perhaps as a symbol of injustice done to him. He saw himself as wronged. In some ways, he was treated harshly by a crown that had used him, and then recoiled when his governance became inconvenient. But this self-pity sits uneasily beside the suffering he helped unleash. A man can be wronged by power and still have wronged others far more deeply. History rarely gives us clean figures. Columbus was brave. He was skilled. He was stubborn beyond ordinary measure. He was also vain, grasping, cruel, and trapped inside assumptions that made other people available to him. He did not discover an empty world. He collided with inhabited ones and tried to translate them into profit. He died in 1506, still insisting that he had reached lands near Asia. He never fully understood the map he had opened. Other Europeans would soon give the continents new names, draw new charts, and build new ambitions over his mistake. But Columbus remained a man who thought the Caribbean was a doorway to the Old East. not the threshold of a new Atlantic world. And yet, the consequences of his voyage were larger than his understanding. That may be the most unsettling part. History is often made by people who do not understand what they are making. The world after 1492 became entangled in ways that still shape daily life. The tomato in a sauce, the potato in a field, the chili in a stew, the horse on the plains, sugar in tea, tobacco smoke, cacao turned into chocolate, maize crossing oceans, wheat crossing west, pigs rooting in forests, smallpox moving ahead of armies, languages mixing, borders hardening, memories contested. You are living in the afterlife of that dawn. Every modern map carries it. Every argument over Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day carries it. A word like canoe, hammock, hurricane, barbecue, all with roots in Caribbean indigenous languages, carries it quietly into ordinary speech. The Taino were not simply erased from the world. Their world was devastated. Yes, their population collapsed under forces no community should have had to bear. Their societies were violently transformed. But traces remain, and traces matter. Descendants reclaim identity. Scholars recover histories. Oral memory, archaeology, language, food, and ancestry continue to push back against the old colonial sentence that they vanished. The story, then, cannot end with Columbus alone. It must end with the beach, with the ships, with the Taino watching from the trees, with the unread proclamation, with the beads in open hands, with the 39 men at La Navidad, with the storm letters in barrels, with the Second Fleet coming back like a shadow with sails, with the gardens, the canoes, the cassava bread, the zamis, the chiefs, the healers, the children, the people who were already fully human before Europe noticed them. The old heroic version is too small. Columbus was not a demon from outside history. He was a man of his age, carrying its hunger, faith, arrogance, courage, blindness, and paperwork. That is more frightening in some ways. Monsters are easy to reject. Ordinary men with contracts, ships, and royal backing are how worlds are often changed. So what really happened when Columbus landed in 1492? A man looking for Asia stepped onto an island that was not Asia. A legal ritual claimed a land already loved. A generous people met strangers whose hunger they did not yet know. A continent did not get discovered. Two worlds collided. The collision opened routes for plants, animals, diseases, empires, wealth, suffering, survival, and memory. It made the modern world, not cleanly, not nobly, not by destiny, but by accident, ambition, misunderstanding, and force. Now let the scene become quiet again. The Atlantic darkens under stars. The Santa Maria creaks in memory. Before the reef, before the fort, before the ruin, Rodrigo de Triana watches the horizon. Columbus stands with his private log. On Guanahani, someone wakes before dawn and hears the sea breathing as it always has. For one Last moment. The worlds are separate. Europe behind its hunger. The Caribbean inside its own mourning. The ships between them. Then land is seen. The cry crosses the water. Dawn comes, and nothing on earth will be separate in the same way again. The fire beside us is small now. The room is warm. The story can rest. Let the flags fall silent. Let the waves smooth the beach. Let the names of the lost and the surviving move softly through the dark. Let the old world and the new world remain in your mind, not as a clean map, but as two breaths meeting over water. Good night,